Welcome back, and that's where we're starting off. We're looking at Nigeria's public debt burden, and to help us clarify a couple of things, for instance, the country's total figure as at December 2022, which is standing at over 46.25 trillion naira, and I'm sure a lot of Nigerians are asking questions. What exactly is going on? How is this impacting our life? How is it going to impact the future tomorrow? The government is winding down, the new government's coming. How is this all going to play out? Well, in the studio with us here in Abuja, we have the Director General of the Debt Management Office in Nigeria, Ms. Patience Onia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning.
So, real quick, that figure, 46.25 trillion naira,
yes.
and a lot of people hear that and go like, what's happening? I mean, yes. Even in revenue generation, we've been talking about the budget of about 10 trillion, 13 trillion, 18 trillion, but we are owing this much.
Yes.
So let's start from here. Okay. Why do countries borrow?
Thank you very much. I think that's a good place to start. Countries borrow, so Nigeria is not the only country that borrows. The very advanced countries, including Germany, the US, the UK, all of these countries borrow. Okay, so borrowing is an accepted form to fund government activities. Okay, but we shouldn't end the story there. Borrowing should not be the only source or the major source of funding government activities, so there should be revenues, which is why the discussions around debt must naturally include revenues. One, because when you generate sufficient revenues, it reduces how much you need to borrow, but it also reduces your debt service to revenue ratio.
Okay.
And where we currently are is certainly not I don't know, some people are very concerned. I don't want to say it's good or bad.
Yes.
Because I do know that the Minister of Finance has constantly emphasized that we don't have a debt problem. What we have is a revenue problem. And there have been questions as to what precisely we're doing to shore up the revenues. But I want to know, you know, what do you do in the debt management office? Do you advise? Do you say, no, you can't go past this? Do you, what do you set limits? Do you say no, so far and no further? What precisely does the debt management office then do?
Okay, so with your permission, let me go back a bit. Like we said, the government borrows, but the debt stock is a combination of several items. So maybe we want to look at the basics. Nigeria's debt stock, the 46.25 trillion naira you mentioned, it includes the debt of the 36 state governments and the Federal Capital Territory. Everything, you know, external and domestic. It's also right to say that the federal government is, you know, responsible for most of that. About 84 to 85% on the average is FGN. So all of that is coming from these various sources. And then what are the triggers? Why is the debt stock growing? Because when the debt stock is growing, debt service also grows. Okay, the debt stock is growing because Nigeria has been running a budget deficit for many years, for decades, not years. You know, in good and bad times with oil prices, we have borrowed. We've been running budget deficits, and those deficits are funded largely, 85 to 95% from borrowing. So that is cumulative. These are publicly available data. So that is cumulative. As you borrow each year, it adds up. So the annual budget deficits are a major component. So if you look at this year's budget size is 21 trillion. Borrowing is 10 trillion. We don't need to explain where that is coming from. So that's one angle. The other aspect where it is coming from also, we've contracted several loans in the past from multilaterals, meaning World Bank, African Development Bank, and bilaterals, Germany, India, China. And disbursements are going on because they are tied to milestone. Disbursements are going on, so that add up to it. The third part, which we must not forget, and I've been trying to emphasize, is government has been issuing promissory notes to settle obligations for which it doesn't really have the revenue or cash, if I may put it simply So that's why the debt stock has been growing. It's a combination of all of that, and these are done very transparently. As you know, borrowing is very, very regulated. So, you know, we go to Federal Executive Council, we go to the National Assembly, and I think at each of those stages, the Nigerian public, you know, have a role to play. They can speak, they can advise. So that's where all of that is coming from. But let us then explain what does the DMO do? Yes. So based on best practice with debt management, we do a debt sustainability analysis every year. As the word says, it is to tell you, is this my debt sustainable? So borrowing is not bad. Debt stock is not bad. What is important, I think two things: use the borrowing well to stimulate growth, to create jobs, and then revenues will come, but also generate revenues. Okay, so that is not, so we do that debt sustainability, put in all those parameters, including exchange rate, interest rates, is a forecast over about 10 years to say, what does the debt stock look like? Is it sustainable in the short, in the medium, and in the long term? Okay, these are best practice World Bank templates that we use. That's one of it. So we advise the government based on our projections, and we don't do it alone. We work with stakeholders like the Central Bank, the Budget Office, the Bureau of Statistics, so that we can get all the data and brainstorm. I think over the past years, firstly, let me say in that report you will see that we tell the government over this next year, this is the maximum we should borrow. Included there as well is we've always said that debt is sustainable, but is very sensitive to revenue levels. Okay, and advice is given to that effect. This is where we should stop. Okay, so that's one. The other thing we do, obviously, so
your role is largely advisory.
Yes, it is advisory, and we do that through the instrument of the debt sustainability analysis. That's one. Largely advisory, responding to your question, but obviously we're the ones who do the actual borrowing. Okay, so there must be a strategy around how we raise those funds to make the debt sustainable. So we see that there is X amount to be borrowed. You can't just decide, okay, let me take what is available and wherever it's available from. You have to have a strategy around how you should do it to make your debt sustainable. So second tool we use is the medium-term debt management strategy. So we always have one. Again, these are best practice World Bank tools, which are extremely useful. It's a 4-year plan that says this is how we will borrow, raise the funds provided in the budget or for projects. And the idea is you want to minimize risk and costs. So yes, you have to raise this amount, but how should you do it to keep your costs or debt service low and to minimize your risk? That's the overall objective of that document. So again, that is a publicly available document, but I can give you what we're doing in that strategy to make debt sustainable. So the first thing is that you diversify your sources of funding. Obviously, if you are dependent on just one source, you could have in life, you will have a problem. So we have several sources of borrowing. External, there's the international markets, there are the multilaterals, there are the bilaterals, meaning country to country. Okay, now we're looking very closely at export credit agency financing because those are project tied. But in the domestic market, I mean, the DMO has done well significantly in developing the market. It has worked for our benefit and worked for corporates as well. So, but what do? You would see that we have various products ranging from 90 days to 30-year tenors. The idea is that somebody who has money to invest can find something that fits them there. So we have Nigerian Treasury bills, which are short. We have the federal government of Nigeria bonds, which are all the way to 30 years. And then we have introduced a product for retail investors, the FGN savings bond. We talked about it at an event recently. And then very importantly, we have the Sukuk to attract non-conventional investors, if I may put it that way, as well as the green bonds. So while all of those are innovative, they are actually helping us to increase the sources from which we can raise revenues rather than what it was more than 10 years ago where the banks were our primary sources of funding. Okay, so we spread out the maturity. So we have different tenors. So when people talk about the debt, all of it is not maturing in one day. Are you with me? They're spread out over many years in the domestic and in the external markets. And then there are various products. Then every year we support that strategy with the debt sustainability analysis. So while it is true that debt service to revenue is high, it is not that the DMO within what is in its power, the strategy and the debt sustainability analysis, we are not doing anything. We are, but revenue remains the key. Okay?
So in terms of the revenue here, the revenue that's generated that's supposed to help to more like keep this debt profile how do you say that, at bay, or sort of keep it in one place, sustainable. I wanted to use a language that the everyday Nigerian will understand.
Moderate.
Keep it moderate. How much of that is happening in terms of the revenue generation that government is bringing in?
Okay. I think what we all know, again, I'm speaking to things that are in the public space, is that this administration, but let me speak for the Honorable Minister of Finance, on whose desk it falls, had focused on, and still focused on, revenue generation. Okay? Like I say, government should fund itself from revenues. Borrowing is supposed to bridge the gap. It's not the major source of funding. Okay. So there have been initiatives to grow revenues from non-oil. We know that we've been dependent on crude oil for a long time, for very many years, even though we have talked about diversification. So through a program called the Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative, launched by the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, I believe sometime in 2019, there was focus to increase revenues from non-oil sources. Okay, so that would be taxes, okay, duties coming from customs, taxes from FRS, and government-owned institutions, as we call them, GOEs or SOEs, where they're owned by the government, and the government as a shareholder should get some returns, isn't it? So it's focused on non-oil sources, but also oil, crude oil, coming from, let me put it this way, NNPC, whose name has changed now. So when you look at the budget, and I think we should be factual, in the short term, the bulk of the revenues will still come, or a significant part, not bulk, from crude oil, but on the non-oil sources area, on most of the parameters. So the amounts are not as large as it is for the oil sector, obviously, but there's significant progress. In some cases, those revenues have doubled. They've overperformed. But when the main source underperforms, then your entire revenue line underperforms. And that's why debt service is taken out very prominently, because in the actual budget itself, debt service to revenue would be anywhere from 28 to 33%. But when you then look at actual, because revenues underperformed, that's why you see ratios like 62, 90, and about this time last year, probably 116, okay? That's where it is coming from. So there are progress in that area. You know also what is going on in the crude oil sector. I believe there was a lot after the budget performance for January to April last year was presented, and we saw that crude oil production was 1.33 million barrels per day, whereas the budget is 1.88 million barrels per day. Even if the price was the same, we have lost money, right?
Yeah.
But just think about it, the price of crude oil more than doubled because of the Ukraine-Russian war. Crude was at over $100 per barrel. So that was a significant pull down in terms of performance. So that's why debt service to revenue is even worse when you look at the actual.
But you also know that as at yesterday, there was that news about Nigeria's crude, looking for buyers for Nigerian crude, not as much as it was being sought after before, again, because of a glut in the market space.
Yes.
But let's come back again. We know that there's that issue about the revenue generation for Nigeria, mostly dependent on crude. Yes, we have the non-oil revenue side, again, not enough as it should be.
But improving.
But that figure of over 46 trillion naira, let's go back there again.
Okay.
Now, in looking at it, it is known that the federal government alone has about 16 trillion naira, and states have about 1.9 trillion naira. I mean, looking at the figures as they are, but the total domestic debt on its own is about 27 trillion.
Yes.
Over 27 trillion.
Yes.
If you put all of that together, and of that 27, FG alone that's domestic.
Yes.
The 18 is foreign. Right? But domestic, FG alone has 22 trillion, and the state 5 trillion.
Yes.
In the debt management office, when you look at these figures, how do you feel? How does your office look at, okay, how do we move forward? Because you're supposed to keep it at a balance, a little below 60%, right, to GDP. Is that not what it's supposed to be?
Okay, when
debt to GDP here.
40%.
40%.
Total public debt to GDP.
What we have now.
It should be 40, but it is 23% now.
Okay. Are we hoping to get to 40? Please don't say yes.
Okay, I believe this is an opportunity to share information. Okay, so that ratio is 40%. Like I said, as of December, we were at 23%. when you just look at some of the key items that will hit the debt stock, and I think we should be factual, and one of the things I'm hoping to be able to achieve here is we are not in shock when the debt stock grows. Okay, you know there's 10 trillion of new borrowing in the budget for this year. So by December, if you see an increase of 10 trillion, you shouldn't be saying, how did it happen? Because it was there in the budget. Then there's the Ways and Means, which is in the public space before the National Assembly. That's 22.7 trillion waiting for approval. Then there's 1 trillion that was approved last year for the supplementary budget. So I wish I could tell you to stay at 46. But the point I'm making is there are already things that will be added to this. So once the Ways and Means is approved, for instance, the 22.7, it hits the debt stock. So that's, are you asking whether it will still, maybe by then we'll be approaching about 40%. But I think the issues around the Ways and Means are there. It's already been spent. So in the interest of debt transparency, you should include it in your debt stock once that approval is gotten. But let me speak to your issue around the FGN versus the states. So of the total debt, really, the FGN owns, on the average, 84 to 86% when you go back quarterly, half yearly. We do those numbers half yearly. In some ways, that is not to be unexpected because the Constitution gives the federal government more responsibilities. We're responsible for security, we're responsible for foreign affairs, and those things on the exclusive list. Okay, so we have those responsibilities. So that's why the share of the 36 states is lower. But the point to be made is that the debt stock has been growing from all of these angles. Okay, so for the FGN, for instance, if I may just look at my notes, so we gave the figures for 2021, total was 33 trillion, 2021. 2022 is 38.9. For the states, they grew from 6.4 to 7.33, so they're growing from all sides.
Okay, so just before we take this to our colleagues in Lagos, there are a few questions I'd like to ask you. When a lot of people think about our debt profile, it does make them nervous. It makes the average Nigerian very nervous, especially when you now begin to see the controversy around the Ways and Means, the fact that the federal government should not borrow beyond a certain percentage of the previous year's budget, and the federal government obviously has overshot that. And there are questions as to how it can pay back that debt. So I'm wondering, as somebody who sits atop the management of all of this, do you get nervous sometimes?
I should say very clearly that I am concerned, and these days I'm more of a revenue advocate because, like I said, total public debt to GDP is about the lowest in Africa. And when you compare it, so countries like Kenya, Angola have over 60%. If you look at the other countries, the US, the UK, and Germany, they have over 100% of debt to GDP, yet their people are not screaming that debt is too much. That's because there's revenue to support it. You can service it. And I think before and I hope I'm not digressing from your question, I think you have to ask, is borrowing a bad thing? If you use it to stimulate your economy, invest in capital projects that will generate jobs, attract businesses, because if you have capital, then companies obviously can come and do business here. So both your GDP and revenues will grow, whether it is personal income tax or corporate income tax or levies or duties. It's supposed to stimulate growth. That's why you have that ratio of public debt to GDP. That is the relationship. Okay, so if you look at Nigeria's case again, from about 2015, there was a collapse in crude oil prices. The government had to do a supplementary, I believe, in 2016, and came up with a program called the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan.
The ARGP.
Yes, good. So what is important about that document, and there were a number of private sector experts who worked with the government on that document, what is important one of the important things to highlight in that document, it did say that government will stimulate growth by borrowing from local and external sources. So if you look at the budgets from 2016, you will see fairly high levels of borrowing than we had before. The idea is, okay, we'll do infrastructure, we'll create jobs, we'll do all of that. External borrowing was also to support external reserves. You know, when you borrow externally, the money goes to the central bank, but obviously they give us the naira to spend. So there was a strategy around it, and we shouldn't forget that the implementation of that strategy brought us out of recession. And then if you look at the debt narratives, after that, you will see the new borrowing started declining marginally up to the first 2020 budget. Then COVID happened, we had to rework that budget, and since then borrowing has sort of, yes, keep going up. But we did perform better than projected in 2020 and have still been growing. So debt in itself is not a bad thing, and I think we need to disabuse ourselves from that.
I think a lot of Nigerians know that. The question is whether, you know, they are right to be nervous when they see the fact that revenue is not exactly accompanying the debt that we currently have. But I know that my colleagues in Lagos are dying to get their questions through. So over now to you.
So we need revenues. Yes.
Over now to you, Bukola and Kayode.
Well, thank you, Maokwe. Just to follow up, really, because I'm looking at some of the statements that have been put out by the IMF, for example. Just a quick follow-up to the question Maokwe just asked. And, you know, I think it was last year that the IMF raised concerns that at that point our debt servicing to revenue was 76%, and the projection was that if care is not taken by 2026, it will be 100%. And I think that speaks to why you're maybe a revenue advocate right now, because these things stand on different legs. So let me just ask you, we need to have a perfect understanding again of just what we're in, so we maybe are able to proffer solutions. Nigerians are also able to better understand, support government, hold government accountable. This talk about the incoming government inheriting 77 trillion naira debt. I've done the math, adding the 46 trillion naira to the 22.7 trillion naira ways and means, the extra 1 trillion naira for the supplementary budget. It doesn't quite add up for me, so I don't know. Can you give an insight as to that 77 trillion naira figure that is always thrown around from time to time?
Okay, let me explain that figure. Thank you very much. That was a projection, and at the time that projection was made, we had the debt figures for this September 2022, which was 45, now it's 46. And as I said earlier, you already have ways and means of 22.7, so just add that to 46. You're already at about 69. There's another 1 trillion ways and means approved in December for the supplementary budget, so you're at 70. On top of that is the fact that the state governments and the FCT would borrow, okay? So an estimate was included in that number. Then there will be disbursements from loans that we had contracted years back from multilateral and bilateral sources. These are the World Bank and similar institutions, as well as country-to-country loans. That will come from there. Then there are promissory notes that we're issuing. So that's how, then you add the, for the new borrowing in the budget, about 5 trillion was provided from that we would be able to raise 5 trillion out of the 10 trillion of new borrowing. And that's how the 77 trillion was arrived at. It's based on just adding all these other numbers. It's not only ways and means. There's new borrowing in the budget. There's new borrowing that will happen from the state governments. There are promissory notes that we're issuing. We have over 1 trillion naira of that in the debt stock. Okay, then there are also those disbursements that would happen. And I think, I don't know why I want to move away from the fact when we say the incoming administration will inherit. Will inherit, but all of these were borrowings that were duly approved. Some are still in, like the ways and means of 22.7 is still in the process of being approved. The 1 trillion already has been approved. So keep those in mind, and I'd like to clarify that. So if any of these assumptions doesn't happen, then it won't be 77 trillion, okay?
Right.
And it's total public debt, not FGN only.
Right. It's important to
That's
also...
as far as the maths go for the 77.
Okay, so the update should be if those projections go right, all of the incoming governments at federal and state levels might be inheriting that, not just, the incoming president, as, the message hits home from time to time. But we need to ask this, really, because a lot of Nigerians see those figures, and as Maokwe said, they feel anxious. In fact, it's now a political discussion. It's an easy way to maybe discredit a government. It's an easy way to campaign as well, saying, well, look at those debt figures. I'm going to ensure we get out of it, or why will the government borrow this much and there's not as much to show for it? Is there a time when we'll ever get out of borrowing? Yes, you have said that countries borrow, but is there ever a time where we're hoping and perhaps we'll get out of this borrowing cycle? Is that utopian?
Okay, no, I think that would be my wish, if I must confess publicly. That would be my wish. But you still have a debt stock you are dealing with, right? So that doesn't disappear. Those are contractual obligations. You still have to service them, you know, as and when they are due. So the borrowing that you can curtail, I think, which is the major contributor to the growth in debt stock, is really the borrowing in the budgets, the annual budgets. Just go back 20 years, you would see every year there was a deficit and it was funded by borrowing. Okay, so how will that happen? It will happen from two ways. When revenues grow significantly to finance the government's, the FGN. So on this one, I'm speaking to the FGN, I can't speak for the states. When the government's revenues are sufficient to finance its expenditure. Okay, the other thing also is there something you can do about expenditure? You know, in order to bring it closer to your revenues so that you don't have a deficit, because the budget is a product of, you know, revenue less expenditure, and then this large deficit shows up. So those are two things you can do. You can look at your revenues, you can look at your expenditure, and that will impact automatically on whether you need to borrow or not. But if you ask me, do we have prospects, do we have potentials? Yes. So why is the revenue not coming as it should? We've talked significantly about what could have happened last year if we took all the windfall that came from very high crude oil prices. Countries like Angola, an oil-producing country like Nigeria, did very well on those, and the economy, you know, has improved significantly. The countries in the Middle East, who are oil-producing countries, also did very well from that windfall. Even if you didn't produce a barrel more than you should, your revenues just doubled from oil. So just imagine what that would have done for us. So maybe we need to look at those revenue lines. What are we not doing that we should have been doing? So I understand production has gone up a bit, and speaking to the comment this morning, OPEC is, I think, attempting to reduce production to take prices up. But yes, we can interrogate revenues, be more mindful of revenues, and I think, if you ask me, I think we have focused more on the debt issue as opposed to being very sensitive to the revenue issues. Thank you.
Still on your mandate, as you say, being in an advisory capacity, but this time as it relates to states, states also, you know, sometimes have to borrow, and you have said that borrowing is the norm, that countries need to borrow to stimulate their economy. But as it has to do with states now, I wonder if the advisory mandate of the Debt Management Office also extends to states, because in the past, the requests by some state, a certain state now, to borrow caused not a little ruckus, you know, at the National Assembly. So in comparison to their charge to, you know, generate revenue internally, what's the advice? What's the advisory capacity of the DMO to states, and does it also conduct that assessment, debt assessment for states as well, and advise states on how to go about borrowing as well?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just rephrase the language where you say countries need to borrow. Quoting me as saying countries need to borrow. The language more is that it is not unusual or uncommon for countries to borrow, but you should use it to stimulate your economy. Not need. If you have a balanced budget, you don't need to borrow. As a country, if your revenues match your expenditure, you don't need to. Okay, so that is not the language, if I may just correct it. But you asked a very important question as to what do we do with the states, whether we provide advisory service. Yes, the DMO does have a dedicated department that looks after the states. That's how come, working with them over the years, we're able to know what their domestic debt data is. So before we knew the external only, because based on the Debt Management Office Act, it's only the federal government that can borrow externally and then on lend to the state. So we knew those figures. But in working with them, at least we've been able to establish their debt data, and we publish it, you know, every 6 months. So that's step one. To be able to advise somebody, you need to know what they have. Okay, so included in that program is training support for the states. All of the states that have been, collaborated with us, we've done capacity building for them. Essentially, what we were trying to do was to create a similar DMOs at the state level so that they can do all the same things we're doing, advising their state governments, doing their own debt sustainability analysis and their medium-term debt management strategy. I should say in that regard, we provided advisory services for them, but we've also been privileged to be part of the SIFTAS program that we worked with on the World Bank. So now, but even before then, all the states have their own debt management departments. Some call it units, but essentially they are DMO at the federal, replicated at the state level to provide similar services to their government that we provide. We've trained them on things like the debt sustainability analysis and the medium-term debt management strategy. And I'm happy to say some states have already done that and submitted reports for us to evaluate. And that is still going on. Okay, so we do provide, I would say, very significant, maybe intense services to the state governments in that regard. And the rules that apply to the federal actually apply to them as well. If a state wants to borrow, it has to go to its state executive council, and then it goes to the state assembly as well. So those rules apply as well.
Still on our revenue, we've been experiencing a decline with the Forex reserve, but a strong point that has been advocated in favor of Nigeria is that we have 500 million naira euro bond. How much of that is a shock absorber, to the declining foreign reserve that we have, and indeed, our borrowing escapade, so to speak?
Okay, I don't think it's an escapade to the extent that your borrowing is properly documented and approved, so I won't use escapade. It's properly documented and approved as required by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The reason I'm trying to change some of the words is because these are the things that give sometimes the public the impression that the present administration, sometimes the go personnel has raised so much. So let's go through. There's a process. There's an engagement. There's a public hearing on all of those borrowings at the National Assembly, including, the medium-term expenditure framework. So let's not be like it just happened. We just saw the numbers in the books. Speaking about external reserves, I think one of the things the rating agencies have commended us on, including even Moody's, again, I did say one of the tools we adopt is to have different maturities. So Nigeria is one of the only countries that doesn't have several. I won't mention some of the other countries that you may be familiar with. So all we have maturing this year, when I say all, I don't mean it's a small amount, but it's a $500 million euro bond. So we spread maturities each year so that there are no 3 maturities each year. This is just one that is maturing. The next one, I believe, is about 2 years' time unless we issue, spread out over 30 years. Okay, so that it's not a big sum that comes and you are panicking, what do I do? That's the case that has happened with at least 2 countries, and about 2 others are going through that issue. So talking about the $500 million Eurobond maturing in July, the first thing I think I like to say is that when those funds are raised, they come in as dollars into the Central Bank of Nigeria. So if you just go back and track the data, you will see each time we issue a Eurobond, give or take 1 week after that, when settlement takes place, external reserves shoots up by that exact amount. So it's not a loss that it is coming, it has to, at some point it has to go out because it's a loan, which is why revenues are important. They don't leave you, they stay with you. Okay, so when that matures in July, we would pay the $500 million. And let me explain that debt service is very carefully planned. Not only do you have it in the budget, so you see the lines, you see the domestic, you see the external. It doesn't just, okay, we're just being told something is happening here. No, it's planned and provided in the budget. But beyond that, underneath the surface, so both the Honorable Minister and the Central Bank have information on what is maturing monthly on external debt, because you need to plan for it. So it's not, and that's one of the things I like to explain. It's not an ad hoc impromptu arrangement. These are all done well in advance, and the Central Bank has all the details, including the currencies. So we can all plan, and we know that this is what, so those have helped Nigeria, and that is part of the debt management that we do behind the scenes. Apart from borrowing, you have to do all of this work to ensure that what is within your power, you manage the risk.
Well, the SIFTAS you mentioned just takes us to the next question, naturally, about transparency and accountability. And for a lot of people, they were a bit skeptical about why there needs to be some sort of incentive to achieve transparency and accountability, which was what the World Bank assisted, funding or project was trying to achieve. I mean, it should be a culture. Naturally, when you get money, the people who you report to should know how these monies are spent, and they don't need to stress themselves to get these details. Audit is another conversation entirely. But overall, because a lot of Nigerians are particularly interested in our borrowings, because they see the figure and they try to look around and say, okay, can we see what these monies have been used for? What have you found out in terms of transparency and accountability, whether these monies are used well? Do you see indicators that maybe point to the fact that these monies are used well? We're in a good place when it comes to borrowing and utilization.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the SIFTES question, I'll just answer that very simply. If you've been trying to achieve something to encourage people to do something and it doesn't happen, if there's then an incentive to get it done, I don't think anything is wrong with that. And the reason for that is to say, look, whether you talk FGN or states, it's still one country and one GDP. Okay, so if you can get all your data, like for the federal, you get budget performance, you get budget, you get projections, you get all of those. But prior to SIFTES, you didn't have those information from the states. People couldn't get the budgets for the states, they couldn't get, so you couldn't do a Nigeria total analysis. So we look at spending as only what the federal government spends. No, there are 36 state governments and an FCT. So that's what SIFTES was meant, one of the key objectives. So we can have macro data and macroeconomy. Just remember that the GDP is one and it is one country. So to that extent, if the incentive has helped with that, so you can go to a state government, you can, some of them have passed their own similar DMO laws, similar fiscal responsibility acts. Their budgets are there, their annual reports, some of them are now rated. If those are the things it has achieved to encourage transparency, I think it is good. What you couldn't achieve in 10 years, if SIFTES helped you to achieve a number of it, I think that is good. So in terms of what have we done with the borrowing, I will speak very gladly about the Sukuk. I don't think I need to say too much of that. We have issued over 740 billion of that. Firstly, it was to attract, an investor component. Like I said, diversifying your sources of funding. That's one objective. Promoting financial inclusion. But we can't deny the roads and the bridges that we have seen arising from the Sukuk across the country. Okay, so initially up to 2020, the proceeds were for works, the Federal Ministry of Works and Housing. But from 2021, we included the FCT. So many of us who don't go outside of Abuja started seeing what the Sukuk is doing. So I don't think I need to talk too much about there's no state in Nigeria that you go to, you won't see roads and bridges that have been funded by the Sukuk. So that's one. And the fact that it was dedicated to infrastructure is one of the driving forces for the DMO to continue to issue the Sukuk. Then when you say what else have we done, I think if you look at the airports, both in Abuja, the new airport in Abuja, look at the one in Lagos, which I think is dedicated, is dedicated to travel within Africa. You look at the other airports in Port Harcourt, Benin, Kano, and Enugu. Those are coming from loans. Then you look at the rail lines that you have. Those are coming from loans. So I don't think we live with these things, we see them. We shouldn't say we haven't seen what the loans were used for. Maybe there should be more, and that will be good. But we do have definitely, and we should not say we can't see what has been done with the borrowings.
Well, that is difficult to, contradict. Of course, we've seen even the second Niger bridge as well. I noted that you said earlier that total public debt to GDP is one of the lowest in Africa, even though total public debt to GDP is set to increase to 43%. But I just wanted you to also look at, comparatively other parts of Africa, the creation of value. If you look at those countries, their export to import ratio, they're doing a lot better than Nigeria in that regard. So if you look at that aspect, are we in a comfortable place, to be? Because also debt to revenue ratio is a subject of concern to the international community as well. My colleague Kari said earlier that the IMF has raised concern that it has overshot, the best practice level. So what are your thoughts in that regard?
Okay, I think probably one of my first statements was to say debt to GDP is 23% as at December, and that is still within the 40% limit for the government set for itself. And let me add, within the 55% set by the IMF and the World Bank. So that still is not an issue. Just if I may go to the data, if you look at Angola, that ratio is 136%. If you look at the US, it's 133. If you look at the United Kingdom, it is 104. If you look at commodity countries like, so Angola is one of them, Kenya is 67.57. Okay, so yes, I did say when all of those loans, the ways and means, for instance, comes in, we could be inching close to 40%. And that is a fact, not 43, but that is a fact, the numbers are there. So what is the challenge? The challenge is debt service to revenue. So let me run through some numbers. So these are World Bank data. It's the World's Economic Outlook by the World Bank for 2020. So the debt to GDP ratios I quoted is from that report. But when you look at revenue as a percentage of GDP, so Canada has 41.9, the UK has 36.6, Kenya has 16.6, Angola 20.9, South Africa 25.2. What does Nigeria have? 6.3%. And based on this report, there were 194 countries, I believe, or 192 countries that the World Bank included data for. Nigeria was number 190, and guess who the other two countries are in terms of revenue to GDP ratio? The other two countries are Yemen and Afghanistan. So the issue is that where we belong? Should Nigeria be performing in terms of revenue at the same level as Yemen and Afghanistan? And I deliberately, include African countries in that regard. Kenya, Ghana, Angola, their ratios are much higher than ours. So I think we can't but talk about revenues. So revenue to GDP for Nigeria is among the lowest, not just the lowest, among the bottom in the world.
I know that even that, having conversations around revenues is also going to make a lot of Nigerians nervous because, the revenue is not going to be gotten from the sky. It's most likely going to come from Nigerians themselves and maybe other
entities,
yes, other sources of income within and maybe outside of the country. But let me quickly ask you how exchange rate, the fact that our exchange rate is, being fluctuated, and in many instances, we've seen the wide gap between official rates. Even official rate has gone up, and also the parallel market. What effect is that having on our revenue profile? And I do not know also how you are looking at this discussion around subsidy, because it's back on the front page, and for a number of people, that's another thing that, we know that our subsidy for a long time was being funded through under recovery from the NNPC, but now is an item in the budget. What is the projection of the DMO with regards to subsidy removal, and maybe how it could improve our revenues or, impact our debt profile?
Okay, so the first thing to say with regards to subsidies, so gladly, that is not in my remit, but let me say what the official issues are. So you know that in the budget for 2023, subsidies were included up to June this year. And in the first presentation of the medium-term expenditure framework for 2023 to 2025, the minister presented two scenarios, one with subsidies, one without subsidies. But obviously, we still went through with the one that keeps subsidy till June. So what has that done? Is increase your deficit. And the next level, what did it do? You're borrowing. So I always said there's this link, and we're missing that link of how the new borrowing arises and the debt stock appears. So go back to what I said. Perhaps we should look at revenues and look at expenditure. So subsidies and expenditure is an expenditure line in your budget. So I just made that general statement. But that's how to manage your deficit and probably in response to the question she asked, reduce your level, or he actually reduce your level of new borrowing. Yes. None of them is in isolation. They are linked. The budget is, they are linked, And the
exchange rate.
Okay, so talking about exchange rate, when I say government, I'm talking fiscal now. So the fiscal doesn't operate at the parallel market rate.
Indeed.
So our transactions are at the official rate. So what is happening in that sector really doesn't affect our books.
All right, thank you. I think that's a good place to leave it, even though I have one other question I'd have asked you, but we'll leave that for the next time we get you here. Mr. Patience Onia is the Director General of a Debt Management Office in Nigeria. Thank you so much for coming in this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, all right, Steady, we'll be back in a moment. Please don't go away.